In a Texas courtroom in 2013, a woman was convicted of murder without the one thing most people believe is essential to prove a killing ever occurred. There was no body, no bloodstains, no weapon, no eyewitnesses, not even a confirmed crime scene. Yet when the verdict was read, the jury believed they had seen the truth clearly. Years later, as this file is reopened, that certainty begins to unravel. The woman at the center of the case was in her mid-30s, a quiet presence in a rural Texas community where rumors traveled faster than facts. She worked irregular jobs, kept largely to herself, and had once been romantically linked to a man who later vanished from her life. When he stopped answering calls and failed to show up for work, concern slowly turned into suspicion, and before anyone realized it, an absence was being treated as a death. There was no missing person report at first, no frantic search parties, just questions whispered behind closed doors. Where had he gone? Why hadn't anyone heard from him? And why, some asked, did the woman closest to him seem so calm? Investigators eventually focused their attention on her not because of evidence, but because of proximity. She was the last known person to admit seeing him. In the absence of facts, a narrative began to form. Detectives theorized an argument. Prosecutors imagined a violent confrontation. And piece by piece, a story was assembled without physical proof to support it. What the case lacked in forensics, it made up for in assumptions. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case was a confession. At least that's what the jury was told it was. After hours of questioning, during an interrogation that stretched late into the night, the woman made statements that investigators described as admissions. She was exhausted, she was isolated, and she was told repeatedly that the only way to make the situation better was to tell the truth. But the truth, as presented in court, was far from clear. There was no recording of the entire interrogation. Only selective clips, no written confession signed by the defendant, just officers testifying about what they claimed she said. The jury never heard the moments of confusion, the contradictions, or the repeated denials that preceded those statements. They heard a polished version, one that fit the story prosecutors wanted to tell. According to that story, the woman had killed the man during a heated dispute, disposed of his body somewhere remote, and successfully erased every trace of the crime. No blood, no witnesses, no tools, no digital trail. The absence of evidence, the prosecution argued, was proof of how carefully the crime had been committed. It was an argument built on circular logic, and it worked. What the jury didn't hear were the inconsistencies buried in the case file. Phone records placed the alleged victim alive days after the prosecution's proposed time of death. Financial activity tied to his accounts continued without interruption. A sighting reported in a neighboring county was dismissed without follow-up. When defense attorneys attempted to introduce these details, they were described as irrelevant or speculative. One investigator privately noted that the timeline didn't quite line up. That comment never reached the courtroom. There were also problems with the so-called confession. Transcripts revealed leading questions, statements that sounded more like agreement than admission. At one point, the woman asked, "Is that what you're saying happened?" A line later characterized as confirmation of guilt. Experts in false confessions would later point out the warning signs: prolonged interrogation, psychological pressure, and the promise, implied if not explicit, that cooperation would lead to leniency. None of that was explained to the jury. Instead, they were told a simple story. A man vanished, a woman confessed. Justice had been served. For years, the case sat untouched. Appeals were denied. The conviction stood. And the absence of a body slowly faded into the background, treated as an odd detail rather than a fundamental flaw. Then something changed. A journalist reviewing old court records noticed a discrepancy that had gone largely ignored. The alleged victim's social security number had been flagged for activity years after the conviction. Not enough to prove he was alive, but enough to raise questions. When those questions were pursued, other overlooked details resurfaced. A witness who claimed to have seen the man weeks after his supposed death had never been interviewed under oath. A storage facility receipt suggested property linked to him had been accessed long after prosecutors said he was dead. And most unsettling of all, law enforcement had quietly received a tip that he may have left the state voluntarily. That tip was never disclosed to the defense. As the file was reopened, the narrative prosecutors once relied on began to crack. The case was no longer about what could be proven, but about what had been ignored. Legal experts reviewing the conviction were struck by how little actual evidence existed. No forensic confirmation of death, no cause, no manner. The entire case rested on belief. Belief in the confession, belief in the story, belief that a crime must have occurred because it was easier than admitting the truth was unknown. Supporters of the conviction argued that people don't simply disappear, that someone must be responsible. But critics pushed back, pointing out that the justice system is not meant to punish uncertainty. It is meant to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And in this case, doubt was everywhere. The woman, now years into her sentence, maintained her innocence. In rare statements from prison, she described the interrogation as confusing and overwhelming. She said she believed she was helping investigators understand what they thought had happened, not admitting to a crime she didn't commit. Whether the courts will ever agree remains uncertain. What is clear is that this case exposes a dangerous question. How far can a system go in the absence of proof before truth becomes secondary to closure? There is still no body, no confirmed crime scene, no physical evidence tying anyone to murder. Just a conviction built on interpretation, pressure, and a confession that looks increasingly fragile the closer it's examined. As this file closes once again, for now, the questions linger. Was justice done, or was a story accepted because it was easier than admitting the truth was never found? And somewhere, perhaps the answer exists, buried not in the ground, but in the details everyone was told didn't matter.